actually like to hear this presentation? Okay, fantastic. So we're live, and I'm going to hand over to Dr. Cliff Simons. Thank you very much, Cliff.
Am I going to need to use this? Yeah. Okay. So good afternoon, and it's a pleasure to be here. And thank you for the work that you do. It's a great thing that you're doing to keep the history of the city alive. We were just sitting out there talking about that, and there seems to be a sort of a good environment at the moment. The council and a number of other groups seem to be on in the right place about that. So I'm going to talk about the code of conduct. I'm going to go into that fairly deeply, talking about perhaps where it came from. If some of you have read what we've written in the book, it'll be a little bit of repeating of that. But one of the things that I think is a bit strange is that even though this only happened 150 odd years ago, we're not really sure about a lot of this history. There's a lot of it recorded, but there are still gaps there that we're not really sure about. It's also known as the Poteriwhi Code of Conduct. Poteriwhi was a pa on the Wairoa River, and that is apparently where the Code of Conduct or the rules for the battle were written up. So, just to go through and remind ourselves, this is the letter that was sent on the 28th of March, 1864, to Colonel Greer, who was in charge of the troops at this stage in and around here, and it was sent to him. So, friends, just a greeting. I'll go through it reasonably quickly. So, the first rule, if wounded or captured whole, I kind of think that's weird, isn't it? I mean... and the butt of the musket or the hilt of the sword is turned to me, he will be saved. So what's that really saying? Sorry? Yeah. Basically, if you surrender or if you're captured, they're not going to kill you. You will be saved. Second one, any Pākehā being a soldier, travelling unarmed and will meet me, he will be captured and handed over to the direction of the law. So what's that saying? Yeah, well, that's interesting. But there was a civil commissioner here. There were magistrates and a civil commissioner. So yes, there was, and there were some police as well. So there was a kind of a legal system, if you like, or a judicial system. Oh, okay. Yeah. That's interesting. I haven't read it that way, but that's another way of looking at it, isn't it? Yeah, yeah. But by the 1860s, the Governor Grey had imposed quite a system of local government in various parts of the North Island, and they called it the new institutions. And so in a place like Tauranga here, you had a civil commissioner, and you had some police, you had some magistrate, and you had what were known as native assessors, who were basically Maori magistrates, or not quite as much authority as Maori magistrates. So there was a kind of a structure there. So this really is that if a soldier is captured unarmed, he will be handed over to the authorities, whatever perhaps those authorities were. The third one, a soldier who flees being carried away by his fears and goes to the house of the priest with his gun. So even though he's got a gun, he will be saved. I will not go there. So that's like that ancient one where if you run away and get to the church, you're safe. And the last one, all unarmed Pākehā women and children will be spared. What's another way of phrasing that? Sort of more modern language? Yeah, civilians, or perhaps we'd say non-combatants. So civilians or non-combatants will not be harmed. And the interesting thing, and I'll just talk about this at the end, and there might be some thoughts on this from you. These are the binding laws signed by these chiefs, or rather the Catholics of Tauranga, which is an interesting one, isn't it? Because Hināre Taratoa was Church Missionary Society or Church of England. Now, the people that we think of when, in terms of the kindness that was shown by Māori at the Battle of Gate Pa, the first one is Hene Te Kere Karamu, and she appears in lots of different ways as part of the legend or the mythology around the battle. So a contemporary, a modern photograph, a painting, and an older one, and this is, some of you will recognise St George's Church, where she's giving water. And there's a question mark, I guess, around whether Hene was actually the person or not. She arrived, according to her, she arrived just the night before the battle. And she didn't know anything about the rules that Hināre Taratoa had sent to Colonel Greer. And so if she was the person who gave water or showed kindness to the soldiers, it was really off her own bat, as a person who was half European, half Maori herself, who had grown up in mission stations, had been a teacher, and perhaps understood the Europeans a little bit better than some others. So her story really comes through in the late 1890s, when she started writing to the Bay of Plenty Times, claiming that it was she who had given the water. So that's over 30 years after the event. And she wrote a series of letters in 1898 and 1900, claiming to be the person who gave the water. She's actually been an inspiration for quite a few young girls groups around the city. So yeah, quite a powerful idea that it was her. The other person, of course, is the man who wrote the rules, Hināre Wiremu Taratoa, who was fought at Gate Pa and was killed at Tauranga. And he is also shown in various ways around the city and elsewhere as the person giving the water. Down here, of course, a lot of you all know this one. Rawiri Puhiraki, the Maori commander, is calling to Taratoa to bring a calabash of water to the wounded Colonel Booth, and that's in the Mission Cemetery, a famous frieze. And he's shown here sitting in front of the palisades at Gate Pa. He wasn't initially drawn or painted by Robley because he wasn't tattooed. Robley was really fascinated with tattoos, and he painted a lot of the chiefs who had tattoos. But as the sort of the younger generation coming through, a lot of these younger Maori had been Christianised almost from birth, and they weren't tattooed. And so he initially wasn't interested in painting him. So this is just a composite later, showing him sitting in front of the pa and holding either the rules or the orders for the day that were in his hand at Turanga when he was killed, that had the verse on it: "If thine enemy hunger, feed him; if he thirst, give him drink." Now, those images and the story that's come through is around the giving of the water. But General Cameron didn't mention anything about giving of water in his report to Governor Grey. What he said was, on taking possession of the work in the morning, Colonel Booth and some men was found still living, and to the credit of the natives had not been maltreated, nor had any of the bodies of the dead been mutilated. And you think, well, this was obviously so important to General Cameron that he put it in his report, which isn't a particularly long report. So there was a real sense of gratitude that the men hadn't been damaged in any way. So why was there this fear that the men who had been left wounded or dead in the Pa wouldn't be in good condition when the British went up there the next morning? And when Governor Grey actually came to Tauranga and spoke to the chiefs in the surrender ceremony or the peacemaking ceremony, he actually mentioned it again, and it was such an important idea that he actually restricted the amount of land that was confiscated. So under the Native Settlements Act, or the New Zealand Settlements Act that was in December 1863, all lands of people in rebellion could be confiscated. It was a terribly harsh thing. But here he promises that only a quarter of it will be taken because of the honourable manner of the conduct, neither robbing or murdering, but respecting the wounded. So that had a huge influence, huge impact on Governor Grey as well. You might say, how generous, he only took a quarter. But, you know, the point I'm making really is that it had a significant effect. Now, just a little bit about, I'm just going to talk a little bit more widely about the development of Christianity here in the area. And I just apologise, I noticed this morning that's spelling should be Ngaitirangi. And the Kaimai Ranges is kind of, when I put this Matamata here a few days ago, I realised the Kaimai Ranges is sort of up here, but Matamata is more or less in the right place. So the Matamata Mission Station was opened in 1835, and it lasted for just over a year. And this was at a time when there was still a lot of intertribal fighting going on. We're still talking about the musket wars, and in particular, Tauranga and Ngāti Hoa and Te Arawa were at war with each other, and there was this constant skirmishing, and it was a very dangerous period of time. Now, the mission station was considered, in the end, it was just too dangerous to stay there. The missionaries actually were burying their clothes. They would bury their clothes and their possessions in the grounds of the mission station in steel boxes, and about every week they would get them out and air them, because they thought that the Te Arawa were marauding through, and they were just taking whatever they wanted. So they literally had to bury them. The women were sent away. The women and the wives were sent away down towards Te Aroha, and the men stayed on at the mission station. And in particular, Reverend Brown, Archdeacon Brown, and John Wilson, who later becomes Reverend John Wilson. And they were really living in fear of their lives, and eventually the mission station was ransacked, and they had to go, and they made their way across to Tauranga. And this is the story of Torori. Some of you would be aware of that. So a party decided that they needed to head off to Tauranga for their own safety, and the young 12-year-old girl, daughter of Ngākuku, was killed by the Te Arawa party at the Wairere Falls as she lay sleeping. And there's a whole other story about the Gospel of Luke that she had around her neck and the influence that had. But they abandoned this mission station in October 1836 and retreated across to Tauranga, where it was safer. The mission stations at Tauranga, Rotorua and Matamata were all abandoned. So there were initial attempts to establish them, but it was found that the security situation was still too dangerous, and it was another couple of years before the missionaries felt confident to come back again, and in this case here it was 1838. Now I mention this because there's a link here between particularly John Wilson and the rules of engagement, or the laws. Now, if we jump ahead almost a generation to the first Taranaki War in 1860, and the famous Waitara Purchase, or the notorious Waitara Purchase, or the Peka Peka Block. There was quite a nasty war going on in Taranaki in 1860, and it spilled over into 1861. And there was a particular battle here at Puki Te Kauere, which was a very heavy defeat for the British. They handled the battle very badly. That's the town of Waitara in the distance, and the land in question, so that you can just make out the river here. New Plymouth had no harbour, and it didn't have particularly fertile land. And the settlers knew that this particular block of land here, the Peka Peka block, was very, very fertile, and there was also a river that could be used for a river port. And so Governor Gore Brown went ahead and purchased Waitara. A lot of the people were driven off their land throughout the war, and there was the British established a very powerful fort about here. And we're standing on Puki Te Kauere here. And Major Nelson, who was in charge of the British troops, attacked this a very, very strong position here. And about 47 British soldiers were killed and a large number were wounded. And the British were actually driven back, all the way back to their camp, and they were literally firing grape shot, which is like ball bearings, out of their guns to try and protect themselves as they were being pushed back. So it was a complete disaster. And as a result of this battle, New Plymouth fell under siege. Now, after this, the story went around that the British soldiers that were lying dead and wounded after this battle were executed, or one of them with a spade. But there were people who were killed. And this story eventually got to Auckland, and it outraged a lot of the people living in Auckland. And Reverend John Wilson, by then, decided that he would go down to Taranaki to try and intervene and bring some rules on both sides, because the soldiers were not angels either. And so he'd headed down to Taranaki. First of all, he went to see a Ngāti Hoa war party that was heading down to Taranaki, and he met up with them at Te Awamutu. And he talked to their chief, a man called Wetini Taiparutu, and tried to convince him to adopt a series of rules. And then he travelled down to New Plymouth, and he eventually went behind the Maori lines. Because he was a missionary, he was respected, and he was able to go behind the lines. And he was actually recognised by some of the warriors from his time in Matamata. And they remember the Ngāti Hoa war party, Wetini there, from Matamata. And so are the rules so he proposed to them this set of rules: that the wounded on both sides should be treated with humanity, that the prisoners should be exchanged, that the dead should be undisturbed and buried by their respective people, and that persons approaching under a flag of truce should be respected and uninjured. And this is quite a revolutionary concept, both really for the British and certainly for the way that Maori had traditionally fought wars or fought battles. And he went behind the lines on 3 or 4 different occasions to talk to the war parties about this. And initially his ideas were rejected, and he was told, no, we're going to fight the way our forebears fought. We will give no quarter. That's what he's recorded in his diary. But eventually he seemed to make some progress, and this is an interesting quote. I'm sorry that it's so long. So eventually, because he was a missionary, he was asked to do some preaching. So here he is sitting in a valley in some dead ground with a couple of hundred warriors from across the North Island. Rewi Maniapoto is one of them, and he's asked to do some preaching. And so he talked about, if thine enemy hunger, feed him. And he talked about Christian chivalry and war. And I'll just read it. This I illustrated by citing to them the chivalry of our brave troops at the Battle of Talavera, who during the cessation of 3 hours in the heat of the day, in the midst of conflict which they had nearly lost 1,000 men, descended to drink at a stream which divided them from the enemy. The French doing the same. They met and mingled together without suspicion or fear, and that our men, seeing some of their enemies on the opposite side of the brook on their knees, lapping at the water, threw them across their own drinking cans. So the Battle of Talavera was in the Peninsular War. It was part of the Napoleonic campaigns. It was initially a war between Napoleonic France and Spain, but the British joined in as well. And if any of you know the Sharp series, the Sharp is based on the Peninsular War with Sean Bean. So now he's obviously putting a very nice spin on Christian chivalry, isn't he? He's saying, Christian soldiers wouldn't do anything wrong. But it's interesting that he actually preached on this topic of on this verse, if thine enemy hunger, feed him. And he gave the analogy of the giving of water. Now, after another meeting, so this went on for about 3 weeks. Eventually, Rewi Maniapoto, who was one of the most powerful chiefs in the country, decided that they would agree to these rules of war in the Taranaki. Now, there's a suggestion that Mikaere was actually there in Taranaki. It's not strong enough to suggestion to prove it, but there is some suggestion that he was down at Otaki Mission Station at the time, and because he was so incensed with what the government was doing in Taranaki, he actually went across to the Taranaki to fight against the British there. And Wilson refers to a guy that he knew called Henny, who he knew at Matamata years earlier. So there's possibly a link there. Now, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the introduction of Christianity in this area. This is Wiremu Tamihana, sometimes known as the Kingmaker, one of the greatest chiefs of his time, and he is the paramount Ngāti Hoa chief from the Matamata area. And he obviously was affected by that 1 and a bit year presence of the mission station at Matamata, because he eventually was converted by Archdeacon Brown here, probably right more or less where we're standing, I would think, in 1839. And he established 2 villages based on the 10 Commandments in and around the Matamata area. One initially right next to the pā at Waharoa there, and then another one called Peria, just a little bit further away. And he had a tremendous effect on his people. There was a church there that could hold 1,000 worshippers, apparently. There were Christian schools. And Peria was more or less a pacifist village during the New Zealand Wars period. So by the time of Gate Pa, you're talking about a man who's been a Christian for 25 years and spreading Christianity and teaching his people Christianity and becoming incredibly well versed in the Bible that you see is so important to him. And when he's actually one of the leading members in the King movement, or Kingitanga, and when he anoints Te Whero to become the first king in 1858, he holds the Bible over his head to indicate that the Kingitanga, or the King movement, is going to be based on biblical principles or led by the Bible. So a very significant act. So what you've really got, I think, here is a leader who is trying to work out how to live out his new religion, his new faith. He's adopted Christianity and he's trying to figure out how to apply that to the situation that he finds himself in, particularly when the war comes along. He's trying to work for his people. He's trying to establish Maori autonomy or some sort of self-determination, but he's also trying to apply this new philosophy that he and his people are trying to come to terms with. So I've highlighted and read there, these are major issues that Maori must have been going through, trying to figure out how are we dealing with this? How are we going to respond to this in this war based on our new thinking? And then Hinare Taratoa, a much younger man, only around about 30 years of age, but he had actually become obviously would have been influenced by Brown and other missionaries here. He grew up on an island in the harbour, and he travelled to St John's College. Now, St John's College is an Anglican school for the missionary children in Auckland. It's still there, and also a seminary for training priests. He's actually up there, and he would have known Wilson's son. Wilson's son at the time was actually the Marsh Brown scholar. So in memory of Brown's son, there was a scholarship. And so these mission families are very tight. They all know each other. He became a secretary to Bishop Selwyn, and he travelled to the South Pacific for a few months. And he ended up down at the Otaki mission station with Octavius Hadfield, and was training under him when the war broke out. So as I mentioned before, did he go to Taranaki? Did he actually meet Wilson in Taranaki? Did he actually speak up and support Wilson? There's a suggestion that I've made in the book that maybe he actually was that guy who spoke up and had some influence on his fellow warriors. But he came back to Tauranga in 1861 because he could see what was happening. He could see the war was developing. He wanted to come back to his people. And he made quite a few changes here in Tauranga. So here's another man, a younger man who was very steeped in Christian theology, has been working as a professional Christian teacher down in Otaki, and he's also come back, and he's trying to work out, how are we going to do this? How are we going to fight this battle? But how are we going to do it not against our old principles of what had happened at the Pa here in 1828? How are we going to do it in this new way? And other chiefs such as Rawiri Puhiraki, the battle commander, was also a Christian. Now, why was the Code of Conduct signed by the Catholics? And I don't really have an answer to this, but you know that the Roman Catholic mission came here as well in 1840. So the Catholics were much later than the Anglicans or the CMS. The Catholics arrived in 1838 in the Bay of Islands, and then they started to spread out after the treaty. And there was a mission station down in Otamotai Pa. And it was there up until 1863 when the war broke out. So a number of Maori in and around the Te Puna area in particular are Roman Catholic. And there are names like Bidwar and Burrell that are actually French names, obviously not from the Catholic priests, but from some of the Catholic traders that lived in and around that area as well. And what I think I've come to understand is that they saw themselves as a different group of people. They still, or perhaps I'll just go back a little bit further. There was a lot of ill feeling between the CMS missionaries and the Catholic missionaries. The CMS missionaries lived in quite nice houses, like this one, and they were a little bit grand, and the Roman Catholics, the fathers, they weren't married, of course, so they're living in and amongst the village themselves. They're living in the Maori communities, and they're living a pretty hard life. But there was plenty of reason for animosity between the two groups. You don't have to go terribly much further back in time to find France and England fighting each other during the Napoleonic Wars. Wilson was a naval officer during the Napoleonic Wars, and Henry Williams was a naval officer as well. So there's plenty of animosity. They see the French as England's traditional enemy. As well as that, they also see each other as traditional Christian enemies. They are at war for Maori souls. You go back 100 years, they were burning each other at the stake and decapitating each other. So there is plenty of animosity between French Christianity, French Catholicism, and English Protestantism, and that carries through into the colonies, and they literally do fight about it. So what I think happens is that the French Catholics, or the Maori who associate themselves more with French Catholicism, see themselves as a separate group, whereas the CMS Maori actually sometimes called themselves the Church Party, and they see themselves more as the establishment, the government, the missionaries, England, British style of things. And there was a feeling these two groups are actually quite separate, and they see it that way. So it may have been more comfortable or easier for the Catholics to sign these rules than the ones who were actually associated with the government. So just to conclude this here, and I think I would welcome some questions and comments. So where did the idea of the Code of Conduct come from? I've traditionally understood that it was, clearly from the missionaries, but in the course of writing the book, I sort of found out this information about Wilson, and I suspect that's a fairly strong link. The teaching that Reverend Wilson was doing over in the Taranaki. But at the same time, Maori had been Christian for 25 years in this area, and the Christian teaching would have been having an influence. People like Tamahana and Taratoa were definitely thinking about that and trying to work things out. Any comments on that first point? Any observations from anyone? Buddy, you might like to say something? No? Yeah, I know. Yeah. Okay. Mm.
and she brought a horseback after the battle and was taking wounded soldiers into Tauranga. And she stopped doing it just on nightfall because she was afraid she'd get shot. So the last soldier she picked up, she took home across the valley, and they nursed him there. And then when he was better, he turned around and married her. And so if you come across any Māori people in Tauranga who have the surname of Hall or Matthews, they're the descendants of that soldier.
And in that story, she was actually taking the soldiers down to the temporary medical facilities that were set up down here. So it's not really water; it's more the sort of the compassion side of it, isn't it? Well, let's just look at this one then. Did anyone give water? I haven't sort of found an exact example of someone giving water, although we did have one of Colonel Booth's relatives arrive and get married at the church at Gate Pa about 10 years ago. And he talked about a letter that was in the family that talked about a Maori woman who had given Colonel Booth water, because Colonel Booth didn't actually die until later the following morning, and he was able to apologise to General Cameron for not having achieved the aim that he had of capturing the Pa. So it's possible that he actually dictated a letter that went home, but we don't have evidence of that. Another thing that you will hear is that those rules influenced the Geneva Convention. It's by coincidence the Geneva Convention was signed in October 1864, and it was started by Henri Dunant, who was a Swiss businessman. But Great Britain wasn't a signatory to the Geneva Convention in 1864. It joined up much later. The first 12 signatories were little principalities in Europe, and I know Belgium signed it, and one or two others. But I think it's a real stretch to say that anything that happened here on the very outskirts of the world influenced negotiations that were happening in Europe, especially when Great Britain wasn't involved. So I think that's a kind of a bit of a myth that has developed. But it's an interesting story. And it's interesting that when Colonel Greer got that letter and got the rules from Henare Taratoa, he didn't really know what they meant, because the British didn't really have a set of principles or code of conduct that they were fighting by either at that stage. Yes?
The Pūraki had in fact been involved with the original writing up of the Code of Conduct.
There was a documentary a few years ago that uncovered a letter that he had written, Pūraki had written in 1862. And I've actually got a copy of it I got it from the Hocken Library, and Buddy and I have looked at it, and Buddy's translated it to some extent. It doesn't really cover the principles that we're talking about, but it was a warning to the British that they shouldn't come to Tauranga, and if they did come to Tauranga, there should be fighting. Actually, there were some rules there, now that I think about fighting in daylight and no sort of sneakiness and things like that. But it didn't really cover the sort of the mercy side of things so much. Yeah. And so the last one, why were the British grateful for the mercy that was shown? Why did this have such an effect? Well, I think it is because of the situation in Puketekaueri, and also in Taranaki, about 200 of the farmhouses were burnt and looted. And then in South Auckland in 1863, when the government drove Maori out of their land and insisted that they give allegiance to the Crown, there was some recrimination, and farmhouses were burnt, and some Europeans were killed on their farms as well. So there was a period of quite sort of nasty, low-level warfare through South Auckland before the invasion of the Waikato. So I think the government was very wary. They knew that Maori had a formidable reputation. A lot of the soldiers that arrived here were not used to fighting people like the Maori. And there was some of the soldiers were actually quite conscious of that going into combat. And so when there would have been a genuine fear that those soldiers that had been left in the pa overnight, both dead and wounded, had been harmed in some way. So there's this gratitude when they came up.
Can I just ask a question in relation to that? It seems to me that in my reading that Maori, with the concept during the period of intertribal warfare, Maori were very focused on utu, and there was a very determined attempt to disrespect the dead of the other side, that was part of the utu and part of the self-glorification. And in fact, the justification for cannibalism was that you then destroyed the mana of your enemy and you took on whatever mana he had formerly possessed. That would make them very formidable combatants.
Like most tribal societies, Maori had lots of levels of escalation in warfare. And so you could go to war for all sorts of things, and you could do things like a low-level raid, or you could just take something and then you would be satisfied. And then it could be escalated right up to really serious combat, like happened at the Otamataha Pa here, where maybe 700 or 800 people were slaughtered. Certainly, the revenge element can be a big part of it, or enhancing your own mana or your tribe's mana can be a big part of it. And that's kind of what I was referring to when I was saying before how these next generation leaders who have adopted Christianity have moved away from that way of thinking about warfare, about just destroying and taking slaves, eating people. That sort of warfare had gone by the 1860s. But yes, the reputation was still there. Yeah.
The English soldiers who came to fight, what would have been their practice during those days to the Maori who they killed or wounded in battle? So what would the soldiers have been thinking was the normal practice for English at the time?
So a professional soldier is basically trained to kill. And so they go into battle when they are full of Dutch courage. The Dutch courage relates to fighting in the Netherlands or in the 1600s, which was gin. But by now they're into the rum. And so they would have gone in with a belly full of rum. They are highly trained. They are very disciplined. And their job is to just get in there with the bayonet and kill people. And that's what they are going to do. And there's not necessarily any particular animosity about it. That's just what a professional soldier is about. And so that would have been their attitude. And just as Maori are fighting for their tribe and for their family around them, the British soldier is fighting for the reputation of their regiment. And at a personal level, not to be thought a coward. Very important for a fighting man to acquit himself well on the battlefield. So if we look at the Battle of Tiranga, for instance, the soldiers are lined up. They know there's going to be a battle. They're ready to go. And when Colonel Greer unleashes them, they just whip into it, as they've been trained to do. But as soon as the battle is over, after about 15 minutes, that's it. They're not in the game of mutilating people, or they pursue the enemy. But then they go about burying them the next day. So that's kind of the way. Does that answer the question? Yeah. So there's no. I guess it's a slightly different cultural perspective on warfare. Yeah. Any other final thoughts? That finishes it for me. I know the time is pressing. Are there any other thoughts? So perhaps I'd just like to say that you'll often hear criticisms about the Maori at Gate Pa and things like that, but Maori in the 1860s have gone through a massive transformation compared to the generation earlier. It was thought up to 50% of Maori had adopted Christianity to some extent. A lot of them were literate in their own language and even in English to some extent. Their economy had changed, their diet had changed, their clothing had changed, the way they made war had changed, the way they made a living had changed. A lot of stuff had changed. And so you're talking about a society in transition. And we see that in these laws of war that were produced. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Cliff. Hand over to Buddy now.
While Andy's doing that, I saw something about it. It was a translation from a French church. And it said, if your cell phone rings in church, it's probably not God, because he doesn't need one. So we'd appreciate if you would turn it off. If you'd like to meet God, we suggest you text him while driving. Well, good morning. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for the invitation to come and speak with you. Like Cliff, I'm very aware of and very appreciative of the work that the volunteers do here at the Elms. I think it's a wonderful thing that you're doing, and the fact that it gives Tauranga history, or the history of Tauranga, a nice focus, I think is quite important. So hopefully when we get the new museum built at Gate Pa, this is the Gate Pa Museum, that in combination with this will give people a real experience of our history. So thank you. What I thought I would do is just talk a little bit about the aftermath of Gate Pa in Tauranga, and in particular just talk about my experience as a descendant of some of the people who fought at Gate Pa, and then what the impact of that was. I'm probably going to talk about the question mark in the title, Victory at Gate Pa, on the question mark, right? So, this is one thing that, despite all the work that Cliff and I have done, we've never been able to find, or I haven't anyway, an explanation to the symbolism on this, which is the battle flag from Gate Pa. I think we can fairly well assume that the cross is a reference to the Christian cross, and the fact that so many of the Māori who fought at Gate Pa were in fact Christians and converts. The crescent moon, I know it's got a strong symbolism in Māori religion in particular, because it occurs again and again. For example, you'll find it in some of the Ringatu Church symbolism, in the symbolism of the Ho-Ho Church as well, and similarly with the star. I don't know if you've been up early in the morning this last week, but Venus has been particularly prominent in the eastern sky, and for one of the iwi that I belong to, we call it Te Tawera, Venus, the morning star, and it's a kind of a tribal icon. And if Venus is shining brightly, you know that things are going well. So whether all those ideas come within the compass of the flag, not quite sure. In 1863, they passed an Act of Parliament called the Native Settlements Act. And what the Native Settlements Act did, and my understanding is that it was based on similar legislation which the English introduced into Ireland, was that if you were deemed to be in rebellion against the Crown, your lands and property were subject to confiscation. So after Gate Pa and Tauranga, the decision was that yes indeed, Tauranga Māori had been in rebellion, and so the confiscation of lands was the punishment to follow. So the original takings were somewhere in the vicinity of 250,000 acres. somewhere around there. But George Gray, and to his credit, I mean, he's vilified these days by most Māori as being he's almost got the reputation of being a white supremacist and that kind of thing. I think he's just a man of his times, to be honest. And as a historian, I find it amazing that he kept all his correspondence. And if you go into the Gray collection in the Auckland Public Library, it's just a treasure trove of material, which I'm just sorry that our historians don't get into at all. So it's something like that, and the fact that this man here, Frederick Whitaker, who I think served a couple of short terms as Premier in New Zealand, but mostly I think he had 7 terms as Attorney General. But Whitaker was the one who more or less gave effect to the Native Settlements Lands Act, and Gray became quite outraged at the extent of the confiscations both in the Waikato and here in Tauranga that Whitaker and his other settler politician cronies came up with. And so it's not surprising when a little later, when Gray realised the extent of the confiscations in Tauranga, he promised to that the Crown would only keep 50,000 acres and that the rest of it would be returned. So that's fine, except what he forgot to tell us was that the 50,000 acres would all be in one place, which is the Te Papa Peninsula, and virtually what the modern day city of Tauranga is founded on. That's where the 50,000 acres is. And the point of grievance for our hapu is that most of that 50,000 acres was our land. So while the confiscation was designed to punish all the hapu and iwi that took part in the battles of Gate Pa and Te Ranga, in effect the punishment just fell on us. And so that just started a long cycle. It's almost like return to the revenge cycle, a long cycle of grievance and attempts to correct that injustice, which we're almost still engaged in today, as I'll explain a little bit later. So the impact of that was that we were then left with a very tiny reserve around Judea Marae. Any of you been to Judea? You know where it is? Right, so it's just that tiny land around there. And then down on the bottom, which is where the rugby ground is now, we were given that swamp as well. So I guess the immediate impact of the confiscations is that it just wiped out whatever economic base we had previously. And if you look at the earlier history of Tauranga, 1840s, 1850s, actually very prosperous times for Māori here in Tauranga. With the help of people like John Lees Faulkner and his trading ships going backwards and forwards to Auckland. Well, the stuff he's carting up there is food grown by Māori. At one time, there was a craze to having your own flour mill, and there was one on the Wairoa River, which was used to process all the wheat, which Archdeacon Brown had showed Māori how to grow. And so you had the beginnings of quite a burgeoning economy, all gone in the 1860s after Gate Pa, and thrown back to subsistence living. And for us at Judea in particular, that was very hard. So what we did was, because the land here in the city had been allocated, the former land that we'd been using for gardens, etc., we actually became squatters right throughout this part of the city. And so along Cliff Road, along Willow Street, Spring Street, Durham Street, Grace Street, wherever there was Elizabeth Street, wherever there's a spare piece of land that hadn't been taken up, we had people on there gardening with their own little gardens, and they did so until the legal owner turned up and said, right, bugger off, you're not supposed to be here, get off, that kind of thing. And in the book you'll see there's a few stories about that still happening in the 1940s, 1950s, and there's one particularly touching story in there about one man and his grandfather who were down gardening on Memorial Park. This man turned up, and the grandfather told the grandson, "Go and light the fire down the beach and put the billy on. We'll give this guy a cup of tea." But there was a council person who'd come along to tell him that they were no longer allowed to garden in Memorial Park, and they had to go. So it's quite a sad story. He packs his plough up behind the horse and drags it off across Waikato Estuary back to Judea. And you know, apart from that little thing, there's also this kind of rubbing your nose in it thing as well. So, as most of you know, formerly there was a ford across the Waikato Estuary, which went from. We've put up a little information board which marks the site of the Durham Redoubt further along Cameron Road. So from there across to Judea, the ford, and at both ends they had a redoubt, and this is the Judea Redoubt, which if you go out to the marae now, just as you're going down the hill to the marae itself, it's on the right-hand side is the site of this redoubt. So you can see how close it was to where we were, and the intent, I think, was to say, this is a reminder of who's boss now. And that was driven home by the fact that after the British regiments pulled up stakes and left, that they then garrisoned this redoubt with troops from Te Arawa, traditional enemies of Tauranga Moana back before the wars, but Te Arawa, what's the term I'm looking for? Loyalist troops, if you like, and fighting on the side of the British. So having these people just up the hill from the pa, you can see the kind of reminder and message that sends. So we're living in hovels and things like this wherever we can find space here in the city, and here's an example of one of those campsites. It's just a life of grinding poverty. We just can't appreciate it now. And, you know, I'm just so grateful to families like the Mathesons. If you go into the library at the moment, they've got a display of archaeology around the city, and one of them is the archaeology to do with Otamuitai Pa, which of course was part of the Matheson estate. Interesting, the Mathesons bought their farm off Māori. The Māori they bought the farm off were those who had fought on the side of the Crown at Gate Pa and had been awarded that land. So it's kind of a double blow again. But the Mathesons are revered in our hapu for their kindness, so, you know, in return for helping them with looking after the land. Some of us were allowed to live there. We're having a bit of discussion about this with the library staff. I reckon this is shows people gardening up on what's now Willow Street. The librarian staff say, no, buddy, they're building the road. But whichever way it goes, you know, Māori would have been involved, whether it's gardening or actually doing the road building itself. This is quite an interesting photograph because, if we go along a bit further along here towards the cemetery, the Mission Cemetery, at the end of the peninsula, the cutting which the railway line and road goes through now. So that was dug by our people, who used horses and carts to take it away, and take all the spoil away, and build the reclamation back towards the Strand. We mostly supplied the labour in those days for things like that. Just step back. So this is you've all seen this, I'm sure, down the bottom of Spring Street. which is a calabash carved by Tuti Te Kaukau, who's one of our foremost carvers in his day. So that was just to memorialise the spring, after which Spring Street is named, and which made it such a popular place for us to have our gardens, because you had a steady water supply of good water. Whoops, I missed a picture somewhere. Anyway, that period of time kind of led to the creation of these kind of ubiquitous meals like this boil up. One pot, because you're cooking on a wooden stove if you're lucky. All the vegetables chucked in, any cheap cut of meat that you can get, whether it be pork bones or mutton flap or something like that. And then that was the mainstay meal for the whole family. And that's actually remained a favourite among many Māori families today. And, if you go to a Māori home and you're offered a meal and that's what it is, that's where that whole tradition comes from. It comes from this era where it was very hard to just to feed your family. So much effort went into that you had no time to do anything else. And so I think one of the lucky things about being at Judea is that we had the whole Waikato estuary and the Kopurirua Valley as places to go and gather food. So it's not going. Oh, it's going? Okay. The land up the Kopurirua Valley is in the same vein. Here's some of our people involved in laying the drains in Wolf Street. Again, providing the labour, right up to the building of the railway bridge. Again, many of our people are involved in that. And things more or less continued in that vein. In between, I think the turn of the 20th century, and right up to the Second World War, there were at least 6 petitions that went in from Huria complaining about what had happened to them. Submissions made to Parliament. Groups of our people going down to Wellington to support the submissions. At one time, every working person in the hapu was asked to contribute $1 a week towards the fund to continue to take the submissions and the petitions. I was telling you about Te Awete and her grandson. Her grandson, John Hall, who took the first petition down to Parliament. So this continued for quite a while, right up until I think we started to see a change around about the Second World War. And that was because, Judea Marae, probably the poorest marae in Tauranga, raised something like £45,000 to go towards the war effort. So in today's currency, that's about $3 million. So that kind of started changing the thinking. And unlike a lot of the other Māori families and hapu and iwi that contributed to the Second World War, every one of the soldiers from Judea who went away overseas, they all came back. And so we didn't lose that level of leadership within the hapu that many others did. And so going forward after the war, we had this very strong group of leaders within the hapu able to take the argument further and to make sure that our grievances remained at the forefront of everybody in the hapu and their thinking. So this is my great-grandfather, Tauoki Mikaere. I don't know how he managed it, but just after Gate Pa, he was actually living down on the Coromandel. That goes back, I think, to a bit of our own history where in the 1820s, I think it was, those Hauraki tribes were under attack and they asked for help. They were under attack from Ngāpuhi. Ngāpuhi were the first to get muskets, so they were the ones who were first off the rank with payback raids everywhere, including down here in the Bay of Plenty. And so when those Hauraki tribes came under attack, asked for our help, so we sent up a couple of dozen soldiers to help them in their defence of their land, and as a result they paid us with land. And so our family now has land at Coromandel itself, just on the outskirts of Coromandel. There's a valley there which is called Manaia, and we were given half the valley. There's a river that flows down the middle from the river to the skyline, and so that kind of it's a relationship that we keep going right up until today. And so my grandfather was looking after that end of our inheritance. Sorry, my great-grandfather. But it's my grandfather that is a little bit of a hero to me. He was brought up hard. His name, Rātoru, means the third day. And they gave him that name because on the third day, his mother died. The third day after he was born, his mother died. And so there was no wet nurse in the family. So he was brought up on potato gruel, basically. Boil potatoes, squeeze them until they're nice and soft, and that's what he was brought up on. So with that kind of upbringing, he had this burning desire not to have that happen. And he was an entrepreneur. I don't know how he did it, but he managed to get ownership of a small truck. And he would use that to go around, collect vegetables, and take them to market and sell them. And that's how he made his living, as a hawker. He got his hands on a film projector at one stage, and people at duty will tell you stories about how he'd turn up in his little truck, fire up the generator in the film projector, and show those, flickering old movies, charge everybody a penny to come, and again collect the money, which then went into restoring the marae. If it was a bright moonlight night, like it has been this past week, he would have his kids, including my father, out in the gardens working to get the vegetables ready for market in the morning. Very hard life. And so accordingly, my father was of the same ilk. I really get annoyed when I hear people talking about, those lazy bloody Māoris. And I mean, those people of my father's generation would put anybody to shame with their work ethic these days, dawn to dusk, every day, even when you were a small child. My father had to leave school at 12 to go and work to support the family. So he was sent off to do fencing and scrub cutting and that kind of thing, and he did labouring jobs all his life. Similarly with his brothers and sisters. I'll just read you a little bit about my dad. I remember as a small boy wondering why, when my father spoke to Pākehā people outside his work or neighbourhood circle, he was so differential. I think now that if he wore a cap, he would have probably held it in his hands, and if the custom was to touch your forelock, he probably would have done that too. I realised later that he was stuck in a mode of life where society told him that he was inferior, of less status as a person, and this was his response. He accepted without question sit upstairs at the pictures. Although there was a huge influx of Māori and Pacific Islander workers, we were living in a little town called the other side of Pataru, called Wilstown. So that was a timber mill, and Dad was working in the mill. And so this is talking about the picture theatre at Tokoroa. Not allowed to sit upstairs, although the huge influx of Māori and Pacific Island workers into the timber town soon knocked that nonsense on the head. My father, a teetotaler, would never dream of drinking in other than the public bar, where he enjoyed a lemonade and raspberry with his sawmill mates. The lounge bar was just for flash Pākehā people. It makes me grind my teeth to think how he put up with being addressed as hoary by snickering young garage attendants who were supposed to help with servicing the car, but of course wouldn't help a Māori man and his kids. I remember my mother insisting that we eat at a restaurant in Hamilton on one occasion, and my father being shocked by the fact that the Pākehā waitress brought our meals to the table, and that we were allowed to have dessert at lunchtime and sit at a white tablecloth table amongst all these flash people. A kind and generous man who would give, and did, the shirt off his back to anyone in need. Oh. You know, if there was a car parked by the side of the road with a bloody flat tyre or something, my father would, first thing he'd do was stop. And he'd get out and say, "You all right? Can we help?" And, you know, so a journey from, say, Pataru to Tauranga would have about 4 of these stops in those days because of the, the nature of the vehicles that people drove then. You know, we always carry a spare can of water because somebody's always by the side of the road with a steaming radiator. A kind and generous man who would give and did the shirt off his back to anyone indeed. He did not deserve to be treated so, and my heart weeps for him when I think of it. But the journey of Dad and his siblings typifies the arrested social and economic development of many Tauranga Māori, and is a true legacy of not just Pukahina Gate Pa, but all the wars of the 1860s. It's taken our whānau until now to believe that we can escape that legacy. But the battle's not yet done. 2 decades after the Waitangi Tribunal heard our claims, we're still arguing the settlement detail. Many of us remain trapped in the economic cage because on a wider scale, inequality continues. You can see that reflected in the existence of a large Māori underclass, while every social indicator you can think of is skewed. So that's kind of my experience in growing up in a post-war environment with our family and our hapu. His dad, he passed away in 1995. This is a picture of him at his happiest. He's in his garden. Everything's growing well. And there's an excess that he's able to give away to other people. So thanks for that. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Some questions for Buddy. Sue.
So on my father's side, we come here from Tauranga, Ngāti Pūkenga, which is the iwi up the far end of the harbour. And on my grandmother's side, it's Ngāi Tamarāwaho, which is the Judea hapu, right? On my mother's side, there's a Cornishman who came out to New Zealand. His name was Thomas Hunt. So that's my great-great-grandfather. He came out to the Gold Rush in Coromandel, because he came from Cornwall, so he's a miner. He didn't do too well in the goldfields, and he ended up back in Auckland, and then he ran one of the first ferries between Auckland and Devonport. So he's buried in the Devonport cemetery. But his son then went and married a Ngāpuhi woman. So that gives me my Ngāpuhi ancestry. So, you know, I can probably claim a relationship with Shane Jones if needed. But they ended up down in Rotorua, where my grandfather then married a Rotorua woman from Ngāti Pikia. And she was one of the guides at the geothermal park there, Guide Susan. So about 10 years ago, I think, I was in Ireland and I went to the University of Dublin because they have this amazing genealogy database there. And so I looked up the Hunt family, which is our Pākehā name. And so I was tracking it all back, and then I find that the very first Hunt, it's actually Hunte, so it's Hunt with an accented E on the end, came across with William the Conqueror in 1066. So I'm actually Norman. Now I know when I tell this on the marae, they all say, "Oh, you're just making this up, buddy." Last year, so I'm on the trust that's trying to build a new war memorial museum in northern France, because of all the allied countries, we're the only one that hasn't got a museum. Everybody else has, even the Indians. Really? So being in northern France, of course, you know, the heart of Norman territory, I started trying to see if I could go back a little bit further, but I'm afraid my fourth form French just wasn't enough to, in the time I had available, to get the information that I wanted to get. So there's another trip back there to start tracking that side. So yeah, that's my Pākehā ancestry.
Some more questions? Well, I've got one. Buddy, can you perhaps give us a little bit of an insight or comment on perhaps from your perspective, from a hapu perspective or from a whānau perspective, what impact Gate Pā had on the relationship between Reverend Brown and Māori? One of the very notable stories that we talk about here is the infamous night before the Battle of Gate Pā and hosting of the officers in the dining room. And there's been a couple of occasions recently where we've had Māori visitors who have offered some whānau stories about their perspective on that issue. That's been very interesting. So just if you'd like to comment or share on that.
I was actually very interested in what Cliff was saying about the relationship between the Anglicans and the Catholics. And this past week I've had about maybe 120 students from Aquinas College come out and learn about Gate Pā and Turanga. And I was remarking exactly on what Cliff was saying about the Code of Conduct, how the letter was signed by all the Catholics, and, you know, wondering how could that be, seeing as Henry Taratoa was, you know, a CMS convert. So that, you know, there's this other story that I have about the signing of the treaty and Bishop Pompelia turning up late, but sweeping in his robes, you know, which made him stand out immediately from all the CMS missionaries sitting there. And it's kind of, I think for those Māori, many Māori of the time found that when it came to the crunch, the CMS missionaries were on the side of the government or the Crown, but the Catholics seemed to stand apart from that. And so they found that quite attractive, not only because of the ritual that you have in Catholic ceremony, something else which Māori found attractive. But also, how the priests lived among them and shared the same kind of poverty that they lived in. And I think Cliff made that point about, this is actually quite grand compared to that. So there's kind of all those things swirling around as well. But the signal event, I think, which relates to the Waikato War, is that after one of the battles, Bishop Selwyn had become chaplain to the British regiments, I guess, and he was accompanying them. And at one point after the battle, there was a wounded soldier, and asked the bishop if he would carry his rifle. So the bishop had the rifle up on his horse, and some Māori saw that and thought, the bishop is not only is the bishop on the side of the government and the crown and the soldiers, he's also taking part because he's got a gun. So that rumour just spread like wildfire right around the place. And so, I can understand why when the troops came here, why Archdeacon Brown became their chaplain as well. It's an expectation. And so, to a large extent, those Tauranga Māori who'd been with the church kind of saw that as a rejection. What about us? And I'm not sure how Brown felt about that in later years, but certainly it wasn't forgotten. And according to our traditions, at his funeral there were no Māori present. They just never forgave him for doing that. Yeah, sure. Such an interesting discussion.
Yeah, this is something that interests me too. Can I make one comment that war came to Tauranga. It didn't actually grow out of Tauranga. Like in Taranaki, there's a tremendous amount of animosity, and it's still there because it was over the land and so on. But here, the missionaries and the Maori actually were on good terms. There were good relationships. And Brown knew all of the leaders, and they knew him. And the fighting didn't grow out of anything that was happening here in Tauranga. It came here. Excuse me. And as far as someone like Brown goes, there's nothing in his background that prepares him to come and live in a country like New Zealand. Like he grows up in England. And they come here and they just try and do their best, I think. And their very first experiences were places like Otamataha Pa, where they see 700 or 800 people slaughtered. And then over the course of introducing Christianity, developing a facility like this, putting themselves in tremendous harm at various times, really devoting their lives to the Maori people, they see changes. And so by the 1860s, they've seen huge changes that have happened in that 30-year period. And they've got a lot of skin in the game. And their life's work is hanging in this thing as well. And we have to remember that Maori society is also factionalised. You've got some who choose to go and take up arms against the government. You've got others who are neutral, waiting to see which way things are going to go. And some who are actually siding with the government. And you have that in all of these conflicts. So where do you position yourself? If you're a Brown, where do you sit? Where do you sit in this complex thing? And of course, when the soldiers arrive here, these are his countrymen. These are, I guess, to him, culturally he feels comfortable there. But he also sees the damage that this is going to do to his life's work and also to the Maori community that he loves and that he's worked in for 30 years. So I think we have to try and put ourselves in their shoes and realise what an appalling situation they were in. And Brown ends up burying over 200 people in that 7-week period. And he realises that it's all fallen apart. it's been a disaster. And he is also part of the casualty. His life's work is part of that casualty as well. Mm.
Thank you. Any other questions? No? Well, I would just like to then conclude by thanking our fantastic guests, Cliff and Buddy, today. It's been a pleasure to have you both here and speak to this intimate setting. We really appreciate the work that you do in helping to raise awareness about the important history of tauranga. So thank you very much for coming today and speaking with us. I'd like to invite you to come and join us for a cup of tea, and also just to extend our appreciation with a small gift. So, thank you. Thank you. Folks, we will be making the presentation available on YouTube for anyone who would like to rewatch it, or for those who weren't able to make it today. So, yeah, it will be there for preserved for posterity. Please come and join us for a cup of tea in the Fencible. Thank you. Actually, like to hear this presentation. Okay, fantastic. So we're live, and I'm going to hand over to Dr. Cliff Simons. Thank you very much, Cliff.
Am I going to need to use this? Yeah. Okay. So good afternoon, and it's a pleasure to be here. And thank you for the work that you do. It's